Good evening and welcome to the final week of 10 questions. If not now, when? I'm Vic Marks, and our question this evening is, how do we love? We have a special addition to our event tonight. 3 of our students will be sharing their musings on tonight's question. But first, a few thoughts. The question tonight is not what is love, but rather, how do we love? How do we do that action, that process, that experience we call love? I mean, isn't that the question everyone is secretly or not so secretly asking? I venture to say that love is about being alive, is informed by knowledge of our mortality. Love tethers us to one another, to all that we touch, to all that is around us, to the earth, to the past, and to the future. It is what brings us into this room together. One way to think about how we do love is to be part of something bigger than oneself. So for a moment, I'd like to think reflexively about 10 questions, because the realization of this combined course and public gathering has been made possible due to the work of a group of people who we might say labored in love these past 10 weeks. Behind the scenes, we have Arsenio Apilanes, Mark Goebel, Ginger Holguin, Diana Alvarez, Kylie Kerrigan, Avishai Artsy, and the formidable Anne-Marie Burke. Our devoted graduate teachers, Anne Hay Young and Triwi Harjito, are less visible on Monday nights, but intrinsic to the experience of our students. Kevin Kane, the Visual and Performing Arts and Education Program, and the teachers and students in schools and communities across Los Angeles built, created, decorated, danced, sang, and performed in response to our questions. These groups brought 10 questions into Los Angeles, and in turn, we were delighted to have these folks with us at UCLA. Thank you to our live captioners who captured our words on the screen. And then, of course, there are the many UCLA professors and affiliated community members, 30 in all, who gave lovingly of their time and thoughts to make 10 questions possible. And then there is you. Are you? There's you, our students, and everyone else who is here with us. Thank you for making this happen. And I have a question for you. When is your work an act of love? Specifically, what have you worked on with others this past fall? Put another way, what did you do or make with others that caused you to be part of something larger than yourself? Consider large and small ways in which you participated to make something happen. A meal, a project, a course, a class, a team. Yes, I'm asking you to write into the chat and to send that chat to everyone so we can all see. What did you do? What did you make that connected you with others? As the evening unfolds, we very much want to hear from you. And while you're doing that, and please do keep doing that, I want to ask, how is education love? Let's try this. Our curiosity and our desire to be connected through actions and ideas to one another is really about love. The truth is, we are all one another's teachers. The questions we ask and the experience we bring when we gather enriches us all. This evening, 3 of our students have generously volunteered to share 1-minute musings about love from their own perspectives. I'd like to introduce Hayden Carroll, who is a UCLA sophomore planning to study psychology and film. Hayden grew up outside of Memphis, Tennessee, and is a graduate of the International Baccalaureate Diploma Program. Welcome, Hayden.
How do we love? For me, I will answer this question by telling you about someone that I love very much. My dog Kentucky has been in my life since I was 6 years old and he was 5.5 months old. I have one human brother, but pretty much right when I met Kentucky, my number of siblings went from 1 to 2. Over the years, the two of us have gone through a lot together, but I've always known that Kentucky would be here for me. When I am mad at everyone else in the world, I always know that I can sit with him and talk to him, and he will listen to it all. I dance in front of him to my favorite songs and serenade him. Over the past few years, Kentucky has had some health issues, and I have made sure to stick by him as he has always stuck by me. I will beg him to eat more food when he isn't really in the mood to eat, and I'll let him outside early in the morning or late at night when he needs me to. Kentucky and I lived on the couch together for almost 2 years because we needed to be near each other, and that is where we both could be. Kentucky is my best friend, and because of that, I feel like answering this question is best said by discussing him. I love Kentucky by making sure he has what he needs, but also what he wants, as long as that does not conflict too much with what he needs. I love him by making sure that I take care of myself too, as I know he loves me very much as well. I love my best friend Kentucky by caring for him, as he has always cared for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayden. Please share your appreciation for Hayden in the chat. And do you have an animal who you love and who has made you feel loved? If you do, put their name in the chat. Anastasia Kamal Ishak was born and raised in California and graduated high school at the age of 16. She started her undergraduate career at Chaffey Community College and transferred to UCLA as a psychology major. Anastasia plans on pursuing advanced education in clinical psychology and hopes to work with individuals who struggle with mental health. Welcome, Anastasia.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I would like to thank you for having me and for giving me the opportunity to be here and give my insights on the question of how do we love. Growing up, we all probably watched Disney films that included princesses falling in love with their prince, leading to their happily ever after. We likely grew up to believe that romantic love was as easy and simplistic as reflected in the animated films that we would watch as children. I was 100% guilty of this. I believed in the social construct of romance in which I would fall in love with a person through fate, and that would be my happily ever after. I went through a quite difficult experience where I had to choose to love myself over loving the wrong people who did not seem to value my presence or my well-being. I'm proud to say that making the decision to cut these individuals out of my life has been the best decision I have ever made. However, I went through the hardship of learning to love myself shortly after choosing myself. So when I found out that we could volunteer as students to speak on this topic, I thought to myself, maybe someone could benefit from hearing from this. Self-love is the most important type of love to practice. The surprise of not being loved and cared for the way I deserved was traumatic, to say the least. What I mean by self-love is valuing oneself, knowing one's worth, being aware that you deserve the best, setting boundaries with others, and most importantly, being gentle with yourself. This is all much easier said than done, and I recognize how hard it could be to practice this all while coming out of a traumatic experience. I really want to emphasize the next thing that I'm about to say, because it was when I came to terms with this idea that I realized how important it is to value oneself before valuing another individual. Your value does not decrease based on someone's inability to see your worth. I'll repeat myself again, just in case. Your value does not decrease based on someone's inability to see your worth. We're all precious in our own and unique ways. And I stress this because without falling in love with yourselves first, we simply cannot spread that love to those around us. Please value yourself before ever valuing another person. Again, thank you for having me.
Anastasia, so beautiful, so important what you're saying. Please, again, share your appreciation for the boldness and for the vulnerability that's being expressed here, and that Anastasia is sharing that with us. And also, have you had experiences where what looked like love turned out to be something else? I don't think Anastasia is alone. Please keep adding into the chat. I know it matters to everyone. Ramsey Sultan is originally from San Diego, where he also went to community college. Ramsey is currently a fourth-year political science major at UCLA and plans to apply to law school next fall. Welcome, Ramsey.
Thank you, Vic. All right, guys. With that being said, I love you. We hear and say these words a lot, but talk is easy. I could say 1,000 things about how I adore Professor Marx, but words are empty without action. For example, I can say my intention is to wake up at 6 a.m. However, if I don't do it, then it's worthless. The idea of love should be perceived the same way. For example, I love my little sister, and I tell her all the time how much I care for her. However, if I were to come back from school and never spend time with her and never give her the attention she wants from me, how am I personifying my action and showing that I really do love her? Let me pose you guys a question. Would you rather have someone say they're going to take you out to the best restaurant in LA and actually take you? Or would you rather have someone give you a hollow promise? I'm probably sure everyone would say they would prefer going to the actual restaurant. I suggest that love is something one does rather than says. I very much believe words are still important, however. For example, I'm speaking now. And by the way, I truly love you all. And if you love me back, type it in the chat right now. I'll give you guys some time. See, words do matter. I appreciate it. Moving on. Before you can love others, you need to love yourself first. As cliche or corny as it sounds, it's so true. If I have a negative perception of myself, it makes loving someone else so much more difficult. Or even worse, it makes my perceived love of others a way to avoid confronting my own personal growth. Learning to love oneself is a journey. And while it'll never be fully accomplished, those glimmers of self-love bring forward the ability to actually love others. Now I know, I'm only allowed 1 minute. So I just want to end my presentation with this. Love is not about heartbreak or poor emotion or negative feelings. It's about good things and feeling good. So I tell you all this tonight. Focus on your goals, your health, and your relationships with your close friends and family. Help them to be the persons they want to be. They will help you to be your best self as well. Now, look, I know life is difficult and it's far easier said than done. And this doesn't develop overnight. But all you need to do is take it day by day in order to achieve the journey of trying to love yourself first. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramsey. That was fantastic. And I see you did get a lot of love in the chat. Words really do matter, though Ramsey's point that there can be a big difference between intentions and impacts is so very important. To all the students of 10 Questions, it's been a pleasure to have you in class, to read your online conversations, to view your art-making projects, and to personally meet so many of you. Clearly, love and how we love comes in many different registers. And I want to add one more thought here. We're surrounded by stories, songs, poetry, passed down generation to generation that are about love. So much of the world's culture, literature, music, films, dance, art of all kinds grapples with an idea of love through notions of longing and loss, wanting love, looking for love, needing love, losing love. My own personal introduction to love as a young girl, perhaps particularly a white girl raised in New Jersey, involved searching and waiting for love to come to me. Much of the literature of my youth, especially fairy tales, kind of before the Disney tales, but quite similar to Anastasia's references. Think Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Cinderella. Each of these stories taught me to wait, maybe even to sleep, until my beloved prince would come. Anastasia and I have this in common. It was my indoctrination as a young girl. But what if we rethink this? What if we reposition these stereotypical notions? What if it is not me waiting to be loved, but rather, what if I am, if we are the ones to make it happen? Thinking back to what Anastasia and Ramsey shared, and back to Sleeping Beauty, if loving is to be awake, then the metaphorical sleep, so many fantasy stories, the metaphorical sleep in so many fantasy stories is not about waiting for someone to make your life worthwhile, but a cocooning, a transitory state before you are ready to enact love yourself. I invite you to wake up along with me. Tonight's extraordinary guests are Dr. Thanh Neville, a UCLA ICU physician and researcher, Ahilan Arulanantham, a human rights attorney and advocate, and Peter Sellars, a 10 Questions veteran and much beloved opera, film, theater, and festival director. Each of these individuals operates in what I might describe as the grandest and most basic registers of love, and I'm honored that they're here with us this evening. First, please let me more fully introduce Dr. Thanh Neville. Dr. Neville graduated from the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA in 2005 and did both her internal medicine residency and pulmonary and critical care fellowship at UCLA. She is an ICU physician, researcher, and the current medical director of UCLA's 3 Wishes program, which fulfills end-of-life wishes for hospitalized patients and their families. It is a distinct honor to have you join us tonight, Thanh. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'll do this. You guys can all see my screen. Hi there. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Thanh Neville, and like Vic said, I am an ICU physician. So as an ICU physician, I take care of the sickest of patients in the hospital. And from this picture, I think you can see that being an ICU patient can be a pretty demoralizing experience. This patient is connected to multiple modes of life support. They're connected to multiple IVs, and he's heavily sedated. It's easy for us healthcare workers, nurses and doctors included, to start thinking of patients purely as patients and not as the individuals that they are. And as you can imagine, taking care of the sickest of patients also means that we take care of a lot of patients who will die. Our ICU mortality is such that 20% of our patients will not make it to leave the ICU. This is during normal times. During the COVID pandemic, our mortality has increased to 1 out of 4 patients. And for patients who are mechanically ventilated for respiratory failure due to COVID, this mortality increases to 40 to 45%. So how do we love in these situations? In 2017, I started a program called the 3 Wishes program. And the premise is, by bringing a set of wishes to fulfillment in the final hours of a patient's life, will bring peace to patients and their families. Our goal is to improve the end of life experience for patients and their families and to ease the grieving process. The specific objective is for patients, we want to dignify their death and celebrate their life. For family, is to dehumanize the dying process and create positive memories. and for providers is to foster patient and family-centered care. I want to tell you about the story of our first Three Wishes patient. This is a story about a 36-year-old man and his wife. This was a really sad story because obviously this patient was very young. And when I inherited his care, it was obvious that he was already dying, if not for weeks in the ICU. And when I talked to his wife, I learned that the thought of him dying within the four walls of the ICU was unbearable. This is an extremely young couple who just got married, who moved to Santa Monica to start a new life. They love the great outdoors. They love hiking. They love sunsets. That was a really important time for them. So in talking with her, I realized she really didn't want him to die in the hospital, and it was really difficult for her to let him go that way. So what we did was that we brought the patient outside for end of life. This is a picture of the terrace that is on the same floor as our ICU. As you can see, this is not a patient care area. But with the help of our team of the healthcare workers, we were able to move the patient's bed, his IV poles, his mechanical ventilator outside to this area. And the family accompanied us, and it got a little bit chilly outside, and his wife crawled into bed with him, and I handed her a blanket and she cuddled next to him. And when the sun began to set, I disconnected him from the ventilator, and he died peacefully in her arms as the sun came down. I think that moment all left a very big memory impression in our minds, but I don't think I really truly understood how remarkable little things mattered until I brought his wife back about 3 months later to interview her about the experience. And I asked her, Sandy, I don't know if you remember, but during those moments, I gave you a blanket. And this was her reply.
I actually sleep with that blanket every night. Because that was the last thing that he touched and had on him. So I thought it was very nice that, they were able to give those little mementos out. It's not something I was expecting in the least.
So this was the story that really began our Three Wishes journey. Little did I know that the pandemic was coming our way, and end of life would become even more complicated than ever. Given infection prevention measures, visitation was severely limited, and many families were no longer able to be at the bedside. And as you can imagine, what that means for patients with COVID respiratory failure was that a nurse will be holding up an iPad for a family to say goodbye. So in the next few slides, I want to show you how our program adapted to continue. This is a picture of some keepsakes that we provide to families very often. These are fingerprints from the patients who are dying or have died, and we put them in keychains for the families to take home. In the beginning, I was terrified of doing this because I did not want to give families something potentially infectious to take home. But I worked very closely with the Infection Prevention Committee and basically was able to come up with a protocol in which we UV irradiated these the same way we were UV irradiating our N95 mask and then giving it to families. During my ICU stint, there was also a couple of patients who were the end of life whose adult children were engaged and about to get married. And it was really important for the parents as well as for the children that they were part of the wedding. So we used the same terrace that I showed you before and took the wedding outside. And Three Wishes weddings are not something that's entirely new to us. But I can tell you before the pandemic, these occurrences were like 20 family members would gather inside our ICU, and it would be a very festive gathering. And certainly that was no longer possible given the restrictions. So we took it outside. We got special permission to get a couple more visitors than normal. But I really think that what was really above and beyond is our nurses. You might not realize, but these are actually IV poles, and they are covered in hospital sheets that made up these HUPA and also this arch behind this couple. And these were beautiful occurrences that would not be able to happen unless we put our hearts and souls in it. This was another patient who really wanted to see a live mariachi band before he died. Again, this was not an easy occurrence. Imagine trying to organize and bring a band in the middle of a pandemic through a hospital. I had to get infection prevention permission. It had to be very socially distanced. Everybody had to be masked, as you can see. But I think what I hope you agree is that if you look at this patient's face, I think his impression is quite priceless, and it was well worth the effort. And I showed this picture because, especially since a lot of you guys are students, I'm particularly proud of this. And I don't know, you know, but then a lot of, during the pandemic, our UCLA volunteers were no longer allowed to be in the hospital, strictly with healthcare workers, essential workers. So one of the UCLA volunteers, who's actually an undergrad, now she's graduated, had approached me and said, you know, Dr. Neville, how can I use my artistic talents to help with the Three Wishes program, even when I'm not allowed to be at the bedside? And she and I kind of brainstormed and came up with these commemorative paintings. So I don't know if you can really see it, but these are actually fingerprints of the patients. And what we decided is that if a patient family is interested, is that a healthcare worker would then offer these to the family, and we would tell them about them, and then obtain the patient's fingerprints on blank pieces of cardstock and elicit a few things about the patient, whether what they like or what they enjoyed, or even elicit any requests that the family might have. We then gave these pieces of paper with just a thumbprint to our volunteer artists, who are all UCLA students actually, and who will turn them into these beautiful paintings. So this is a painting of a patient who loved the cosmos, who loved Star Wars. This is another patient who loved turtles, who the painting was of them returning back to the sea. This is a patient who was referred to as the Eagle Warrior in his community. So as you can see, these are like really beautiful paintings that were mailed to families and then forever stayed in their lives. So what I really hope is that the Three Wishes program has changed the culture in the ICU. That death is no longer seen as a failure, but is also an opportunity to reduce suffering, honor a patient's wishes and autonomy, celebrate the life of the patient, and create peaceful memories during final moments. I like to say this kind of cheesy statement, but I think these are the moments that we really stop asking what's the matter with the patient, and instead ask, what is it that matters to the patient? But I do have to say, you know, what I've learned during the pandemic is that my ability to show love is a two-way street. And I haven't always realized this, but it's really important for me to know that the people we are caring for know exactly that we are caring for them. And this has been a brutal awakening in this era of misinformation, when more and more misinformed patients are coming to the hospital unvaccinated and misinformed about COVID-19. So not so long ago, I had to take care of an unvaccinated patient who did not believe he had COVID-19 or that he was that sick. But he was extremely hypoxic. He required maximum oxygen that could be supplied non-invasively. He wanted to leave against medical advice because his plan was only to obtain vitamins from the hospital and return home. He doubted our diagnosis and accused the medical team of wanting to intubate him because we would get $20,000 each time a patient who gets intubated died. It took a lot of time and a lot of energy. And after an hour discussion with him, I was able to convince him to stay. And as the days went on in hospital 6, he developed a pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed. And I knew that if I didn't intubate him and put in a chest tube, he would die. Unfortunately, during this period, I also put his son on the phone to make sure that we had consent and that we were on the same page. And I can tell you that conversation took everything I had and more. His son questioned everything I wanted to do. His son doubted my recommendations, asked whether this was really needed, or whether it needed to be done now, and how come we didn't do this earlier, and how come we can't do this later. And during this time, his father's oxygen was precipitously dropping. I remember losing every ounce of patience that I had left. And I remember shouting words that I deeply regret, honestly. And I had shouted to the son, you know what? If you don't let me take care of your dad now, I'm going to walk out of this room and watch him die. It is with this statement that his son actually cracked and started to cry. And I broke a little bit inside, but his son allowed me to do what was necessary, to intubate the patient, put a chest tube in, and oxygenate him with mechanical ventilation. The patient slowly got better. And about 4 weeks later, he was about ready to be discharged. I was no longer the physician taking care of him, but I know I needed to see him before he left. I had so many mixed feelings standing outside his room. I didn't know if he was gonna be angry at me. I didn't know he would recognize me. I didn't know if he was gonna remember that conversation, the shouting match between me and his son. But I walked into the room and he burst into tears. He thanked me for my care, and all the reasons that I wanted to be a doctor came crashing back to me. And it is in this moment that I realized that it was really important for me to know that he knew that I cared. I told him that he didn't need to thank me, but please get vaccinated, please tell his family to get vaccinated. And he showed me on his iPhone that bunch of pictures of his families with little band-aids on them because they were already vaccinated because of this incident. So what I want to say is that these past 2 months of the pandemic have challenged physicians in ways that many of us had never experienced or anticipated. In this era of misinformation, we're being asked to trust in our own willingness to fight for our patients despite of their lack of trust in us, to not only see the light, but be the light. And it is in this new way that we can still love. And I want to quote Amanda Gorman, what she said, that there is always light if we are brave enough to see it, if we are brave enough to be it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Tan. I think we're going to be joined momentarily also by Peter and Ahilan. Oh, excellent. It's so hard to find words after having the opportunity to see the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And for teaching us about caring at these most important moments.
Well, I want to ask you how you personally find the emotional resources to do this work over time. So several of the things you described, I feel like they just seem just extraordinarily difficult. They just seem like they would require so much emotional, like a wellspring of emotional strength to have over time.
It is, and I fully admit that. I think, like, you know, a lot of people ask me, do I become numb to it over time in order to survive in this kind of environment? And I think it's rather the opposite, to be honest. But I think that, you know, I try not to lose my humanity, and that actually is what keeps me going. I mean, as a result, I think that, which I think is what you're getting at, is that I do bring a lot of it home with me. That these stories stick in my mind, that I feel for the families as much as they do. But in many sense, it still gives me great honor to have that privilege of being with patients and families in their most vulnerable moments. And I think that also very importantly is the support that I have around me. So I have a husband that deeply cares, you know, friends and families and coworkers who live the same things and walk the same walk I do. So I think those things are really helpful.
Don, it's really so overwhelming and beautiful, and
Yeah,
and again, to create a space of life, which is of course the hope of a hospital, but a hospital has so been organized also around kind of dehumanizing people in order to help them be human, and so it's just amazing to have this shift of consciousness in hospital that, you know, wellness is actually part of a bigger picture of also happiness and hope and a sense of being a real actual person, not a piece of flesh that is being kept alive mechanically.
Mm-hmm.
And that none of us are actually mechanical beings. I mean, yes, we have some mechanics, but that's really not the main thing of why we're here. And
Right.
it's just so beautiful to treasure the actual person and not just the valves and the pumps. Thank you so overwhelmingly.
So beautifully said, Peter. I think I know I saw in the chat people were so very moved, and it's hard to very strong feelings, like sobs occur, and I think that sense of believing that in those final moments we could be our most human selves with you is extraordinary.
Thank you.
We're going to come back to talk with Tan later, but I'd like to make a shift. I want to more formally introduce Ahilan. Please know that Ahilan Arulanantham is professor from practice and co-director of the Center for Immigration, Law, and Policy at UCLA School of Law. He has successfully litigated a number of cases involving immigrants' rights, including the first case to establish a federal right to appointed counsel for any group of immigrants, the case that secured due process rights of immigrants jailed for years while litigating their deportation cases, as well as a case challenging the Trump administration's plan to end the Department of Homeland Security's temporary protection status program for immigrants who are temporarily unable to safely return to their home country because of ongoing armed conflict, environmental disaster, or other extraordinary conditions. Ahilan has argued multiple times before the United States Supreme Court, including earlier this fall on behalf of Americans of the Muslim faith who are targeted by the federal government for surveillance because of their religion. Prior to joining UCLA, Ahilan was senior counsel at the ACLU in Los Angeles, where he worked for nearly 20 years. In 2016, Ahilan was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow. We're so happy to have you here. Welcome, Ahilan.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really honored to be part of this event. Let me see if, in light of all those credentials, I can actually share my screen successfully. Did that work? So I definitely did want to talk at least a little bit about some of the cases that you mentioned, Vic, but I wanted to start by trying to actually connect them to the question and answer it in a direct way. How do we love? For me, my understanding of love, and I think the love that I bring to the work that I've done representing immigrants and refugees for about 20 years, it begins with family. And I recognize that's not true for everyone. Some people, I think, have very fraught relationships with their families, and I understand that. But in my case, I learned to love through family, and I feel my deepest love in that context. And that understanding has shaped my life's work. So I hope as you listen to this, if you are one of the people who also feels a deep connection to your family, you try to sort of put yourself in my shoes. And if you're not, if you're a person who comes to that through chosen family, that you'll think of them in that same place. So for me, I was born here, but I come from a refugee community. Many of the people for whom I feel the deepest love have been displaced at different points in their lives. So I thought I'd share some of that story with you today, the story of my family, before talking a bit about my cases. As I said, I was born here, but my family is from Sri Lanka. We're Tamils. That's an ethnic community that's dominant in northeast Sri Lanka, but a minority in the rest of the island. My parents left Sri Lanka in the 1970s, just a bit before I was born, because they faced discrimination and also sporadic violence because of their race. And they didn't flee for their lives at the point of a gun or something, but they just didn't believe that Sri Lanka would be a stable place for themselves or the family that they hoped to have. And as you'll see, they were right. Shortly after they settled in the US, my brother and then I were born. I'm the younger one. That's me jumping on his back. When we were kids, we shared a room. which for all of you out there who are younger siblings will know, what that means is that I was living in my brother's room. And I didn't like that. I wanted to change it. And so I advocated and advocated for it. And finally, on my 10th birthday, I won. In our little house in Lancaster, California, just about an hour north of here, what had been the study for my parents became my room. And that was on my birthday in February of 1983. But it was a short-lived time that I had my own room, because in July of 1983, a month that is of tremendous significance for people in the Sri Lankan Tamil community, and it was just 5 months after my birthday, there were widespread anti-Tamil pogroms in Sri Lanka. And 3,000 Tamil people were killed in racial violence all throughout the island. 150,000 people were displaced into refugee camps, sort of the opposite of love. Many of my own relatives who I had gotten to know through visits as a child to Sri Lanka, many of them had to flee their homes and were actually displaced living in refugee camps. And so I still remember this moment. My parents gathered my brother and I was sitting on the stairs in our house in Lancaster. And they said, there have been troubles. That's the word they used. There have been troubles in Sri Lanka. And our cousins would be coming to stay with us. And they said it could be for a few weeks, maybe even a few months. And as it turned out, they did. They arrived just about a week later, and they ended up staying for much longer than that. For the first set of my father's relatives who came, it was about 15 people from my father's side staying in a house built for 5. They stayed for a couple of years. They eventually settled, moving to other parts, some in the US and also in other places all around the world. But the war continued, and my parents took in more people fleeing. First my mother's side, then other relatives, then friends, then relatives of the friends. And for actually about a decade, we had people living in our house, different people, by the end, almost complete strangers, but people who had been brought in because they were fleeing the conflict and had to have some place to go. And this, now when I look back on it, I think of it as an act of tremendous generosity by my parents. But it was actually very, very common in our community. Lots of Sri Lankan Tamils all around the world did this in the years after 1983. And of course, it's not only them. This is a very common phenomena in refugee communities of all different kinds throughout the globe. So what did it mean? Well, one thing it meant for me was that I lost my room. After having my own room for 5 months, I spent 2 years sleeping on the floor of my parents' bedroom next to my brother. Didn't exactly get the distance from him that I had hoped for. But what I gained was a window into the struggles of displaced people in all different stages of life. This picture is 3 generations of my father's family on his sister, my grandmother, and my first cousin. I got a firsthand look at the barriers that they and many others who lived in our house faced. From my cousins who were right around my age, who were starting anew alongside me in public school in Lancaster, California, to the older ones like her in that picture, whose college or early career plans just went up in smoke, to my grandmother. She was born a British subject in a village that had never seen an automobile and ended up leaving Sri Lanka for the first time in her life on a plane to live out her final years, at first in the US and then in the UK. About 25 years later, we did a family reunion. And that's what this picture is of. As a family picture, it's not the greatest, although it does capture the kind of chaos that ensues when you try to take an Arulanantham extended family photo. I think the funniest part maybe is my niece in the very front in the blue dress. She's caught red-handed, annoying her cousin right when the person snaps the picture. But the picture turns out to be quite interesting for purposes of this talk. Most of the people in this picture, including pretty much everyone in the back rows, was born in Sri Lanka, but none of them lived there at the time this picture was taken. Some of them had won asylum in different countries. Others had immigrated through other mechanisms like skilled worker visas and things like that. There are people, the people born in Sri Lanka here, who are American, Canadian, Australian, Zimbabwean, and British. And then, of course, there were others, especially those in the front, the little ones who were born outside Sri Lanka. But let me ask you this. Can you tell which ones are which? Of course not, right? There's no way to tell. Your nationality bears no mark on your skin. Everybody in this picture seeks the same thing that everyone else does, a stable life for themselves and for their family. And that basic understanding has shaped all of my work. And when I think about why do I love, how do I love, how do I bring the resources to do the work that I have done, I return time and again to this. So I could tell a lot of stories of the families I've encountered struggling to build better lives during my work over the last 20 years. For today, I thought I'd just tell one and wanted to focus on this man here in this picture. His name is Ahilan Nataraja. That's right, Ahilan, same name as my own. He was my first client when I joined the ACLU in Southern California in 2004. We have some things in common, obviously our name, and also our family's place of origin. He is from the same place, the Jaffna Peninsula in northern Sri Lanka, where my family's from. And like me, he has a deep love for family. But of course, there is a fundamental difference, at least as the law sees it, between us. And from that, many other differences have flown. He was born and raised in Sri Lanka. In fact, he was a victim of horrific state violence there. He had been tortured by the Sri Lankan army. His brother had been killed in the war. After he had been arrested several times and tortured within an inch of his life, his family arranged for him to be smuggled out of the country, along with many Sri Lankan Tamils who were leaving to seek asylum. This is actually very common. I mean, it's been very common for years, since the 80s, but it was particularly extreme. Lots of people, particularly young Tamil men, fleeing Sri Lanka in the late 1990s and early 2000s. In October of 2001, after a long journey, which had taken him all across the world, including all over Latin America, actually, he presented himself at a port of entry in San Diego, in the land border. He was 21 years old, a farmer from Jaffna and a torture victim. Immigration authorities interviewed him, and they found his claim to be credible, which is a legal step, which means that he would be allowed to see a judge to present that claim. But they said, first, while you wait for your day in court, we're going to send you to an immigration prison. Because under our law, both then and now, for the most part, when the law permits the government, permits a refugee to present their claim in court, the government is allowed to imprison that person in an immigration jail while they wait for a decision. And so Ahilan Nataraja was sent to the Otay Mesa Detention Center south of San Diego in California. And there he stayed while his case was pending for the next 4.5 years. He won asylum in front of an immigration judge, but the government appealed. And in the immigration system, the government keeps people locked up while they appeal if it wants to. The appellate immigration court said the judge should have considered some other evidence and sent the case back down for a new trial. That's when I got involved in June of 2004. And I poured my heart and soul into trying to get Ahilan out. I would go down to visit him and talk to him for hours, telling him about my life here, hearing about his life there. I even enlisted my family. And the government claimed that he was a security threat because the area he had been living in was controlled by a Tamil militant group called the Tamil Tigers. Some of you might have heard of it. This was false, as it turned out. So I contacted my British cousin, who actually during this time had gone back to do relief work in Jaffna. And he actually went into a Sri Lankan military high security zone to take a statement from Ahilan's family and take maps to prove that actually he lived very close to an army base, nowhere near the area controlled by the Tamil militants. This, by the way, caused really serious problems for the court reporter, because the court reporter had to contend with the client, Ahilan Nataraja, his lawyer, Ahilan Arulanantham, and the investigator, Ahilan Arulanantham. And in the transcript, they're just all mixed up. You can't tell who's who. Finally, we won Ahilan's second trial in front of the immigration judge, But then the government appealed again and again, insisted on keeping him locked up. We won that appeal, but then they did this rare procedural step and referred his case to the Attorney General. Finally, we filed a federal court case saying you just couldn't lock up an immigrant for this long, even somebody stopped at the border. But first we lost that too in the district court. I remember this years, 3 years litigating this, going to sleep with it weighing on my head. But finally, in March of 2006, when we had appealed that decision, we won it in front of 3 judges of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the court held that when examined under the analysis prescribed by the Supreme Court, Nataraja's detention is unreasonable, unjustified, and in violation of federal law. And therefore, we grant his motion for immediate release. I have to tell you, that was really one of the best days of my life. And I say that I'm married, I have a child, that many good things happen, but the moment of coming up and walking your client out of the immigration detention center, and for him, who I had known and talked to for so long, after 4.5 years, there was just nothing like it. We arranged for a meal at a Sri Lankan restaurant in Lancaster, California, where this little refugee community had grown up, and now there were there's a lot of families who live there. It's the community that I'm from, and he had his first rice and curry meal in 4.5 years. In the middle of the dinner, I remember he suddenly looked at me and said, "Hey, is the moon out tonight?" I said, "Yeah, I think it is." I said, "Let's go look." And we walked outside, and he looked up at the sky. He said, "The moon, it's so beautiful. I haven't seen the moon in almost 5 years." At the same time, I won't tell you that everything is sort of perfect for Ahilan Nataraja, right? He's has a good job. He's become a citizen. He has a family, but I think he also struggles still to this day with what it means to have lost half of your 20s sitting in a jail for no reason. Once he was interviewed for a story, and he said this, he said, "I lost my time and my life, and I almost lost my mind too. It's not fair they put me in jail without a reason." And so I suppose that's also part of what motivates me to do this work. A lot of my life's work has focused on the system of immigration detention, which is, as you probably surmised from these remarks, in my view, fundamentally a system of imprisonment without trial. And that's what it is. It's a system of imprisonment. People get locked up where they don't have all the basic rights that are afforded to people who are put into prisons in other parts of our country's legal system. No right to a hearing before a judge where you can ask to be released. Actually, no right to an appointed lawyer. He had a lawyer, through us, but no right to a free lawyer, and numerous other ways in which the system is just fundamentally not fair. I think it's fundamentally inconsistent with our Constitution's values. But more than that, for me, it's a sign of a basic flaw in how our government often treats immigrants and refugees. Like everyone else, they're humans who love and who need to be loved. And I have to believe that if we could see our own families in the lives of immigrants and refugees, we would treat them very differently with the dignity and respect that they deserve. Thanks very much.
Ahilan, thank you so much for that story about the other Ahilan and for sharing about your work with us. In so many ways, there's similarities between your work and Tan's work and the way in which you move into systems and humanize them.
Ahilan, I have to say that your story really struck a chord with me. My family and I are refugees. I was born in Vietnam, and my parents came over to this country with not speaking English and not having anything but the clothes on their back. And hearing your story actually makes me feel really grateful for what I have. They were in refugee camps for a year. I mean, certainly, like, growing up in a poor family was not easy, but I was also not in a jail for a big chunk of my 20s or anything like that. It's incredible.
Yeah, I had a feeling, actually, I didn't get a chance to ask you about it in the pre-time, but I had a feeling you must be from Vietnam, and there are actually a number of Vietnamese and also Cambodian and also Laos and Hmong people who have ended up at different times in the immigration detention system. I've actually represented a decent number of them, and a lot of the same problems, unfortunately, arise in their cases. And for a long time, because those countries were not willing to take their nationals back, which is understandable. People who came here as kids and lived their whole life here, came here as children, as refugees, were also locked up in the system for really long periods of time. And a lot of the first work that I actually did coming into this was work trying to win that people in that situation couldn't be held. If their country couldn't take them back, you had to let them out, And so, yeah, it is definitely a huge issue in the Southeast Asian communities.
Can imagine.
Ahilan, I just also have to ask, what keeps you going in the sense of the weird proportions? It's so simple for the government to just make a law like this, which goes on for generations. It's like things like the drug war, which people act like it's existed forever. It hasn't. But in fact, it's swept the planet and has destroyed lives, by the millions. And you spend, years of your life and one person is free. That kind of the weird fractions of how much stupidity and cruelty exists versus one act of, you want to say mercy, but also just common sense and decency. How do you live with those fractions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it underscores some of what Tom had said earlier about how making the connections to individuals helps to, humanize the work. A lot of what I've done is class litigation to try and help large numbers of people. The cases that I did in the Supreme Court that Vic mentioned earlier were involving a similar issue to Ahilan's case, but there was class litigation involving hundreds of thousands of people. But I've actually found at times that, it becomes a kind of abstraction when you don't know the particular people involved. And that's one of the difficulties of doing work on a systemic level. Then once you're doing it on a systemic level, then you're potentially helping hundreds or thousands of people, but that means you don't get to know them. And that can both, I think, distort the work sometimes, because you don't know, you kind of can lose sight of what exactly it is that you're fighting for. You don't remember their humanity if you haven't met them in a long time, or just even been to a detention center. I would go months without going because it wasn't called for my work, but I think it was really called for my heart in a way. But that's a it's a tension, it's a trade-off, because of course, oftentimes you do have to spend just years helping one person in order to get relief for that one person, and that one person's life has value. Their life matters too, even if all you do is help that one person. So yeah, it's a struggle. That's part of the struggle, I think.
So do you find yourself going to meet the people, not necessarily because you have to, but in order to feel like you know who you're working with and caring for?
Yeah, I definitely, I went through a period in my work when I thought, well, that's not efficient. And so I won't do that as much. And other people on my team will do that while I do different things. And then later I kind of sort of curled around to it, and sometimes would take opportunities, even if it didn't otherwise make sense for the work allocation, to be in the conversations with the people who are our clients. During COVID, we were doing litigation to try to force ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to depopulate detention centers because they were unable to keep people 6 feet apart and do such basic social distancing in it. And I actually had the chance to talk on the phone with some of the people who we were trying to get out through that. And I found that just incredibly meaningful, even though it didn't necessarily make that much sense for me to be the person doing that, given everything else going on, but I wanted to do it. And I think it really helped, and it gave me the energy and strength to try and keep working at it. Just the fact that I could talk to these people sometimes.
Thank you. I'm going to make one more shift here. I would like to give you a more formal introduction to Peter Sellars. MacArthur Fellow Peter Sellars is a distinguished professor and my dear colleague in the UCLA Department of World Arts and Culture's Dance, where he has taught since 1988. Known for exploring challenging moral issues such as race, climate emergency, poverty, and the international refugee crisis through his work. His most notable courses at UCLA include Art as Moral Action and Art as Social Action. Sellars has gained international renown for his groundbreaking and transformative interpretations of artistic masterpieces and for collaborative projects with an extraordinary range of creative artists across 3 decades. Peter Sellars is the founding director of the Boethius Initiative at UCLA, which invites scholars, activists, and artists to work together on projects of public significance, exploring radical ways to rethink relationships of communities and complex issues using the arts as the point of entry and the point of transformation. Welcome back, indeed, for the 4th time to the 10 questions stage, Peter. It's always an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Vic. And hello, beautiful people. It's just amazing to be with this beautiful, beautiful and deep energy of people devoting their lives to life and to devotion. And I'm going to just first of all express just deep gratitude to Tan and to Ahilan. Thank you so profoundly for every day, and for the time ahead of us. And I'd like to just talk tonight about a concept in Hindu aesthetics from the 7th century. There was a great playwright called Kalidasa, who maybe with the 7th century, maybe the 8th century, nobody knows. Nobody knows even his biography. Nobody knows the century. Nobody knows anything about him. Even the name Kalidasa is probably made up. And so it's beyond Shakespeare. It's a mythical being who actually there are many versions and histories of who he is, but he wrote probably 4 plays and then a couple of long poems that are super beautiful. And one of them I staged years ago called The Love Cloud, The Cloud of Love, which I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about, but really what I want to get into is the principles that go inside his work from that period in writing in India, which are basically about the eye. And you have the evil eye and you have the eye of love. And that was really theorized and understood in Hindu artistic practice. And we all know what the evil eye is. The evil eye is when you look at other people and you know you're superior to them. The evil eye is the ability to feel yourself superior to another person, to feel someone else is less than human, who feel that someone else's life matters less than your life, and feel that your superiority means you can judge someone, and you're content with your judgment. And yet, of course, the evil eye is quite blind to your own faults, and you're busy identifying the faults of the rest of the world. And even the act of looking at somebody is murderous. Somebody can feel you're looking at them with contempt. Somebody knows you see them with disregard. Someone knows that they're not being valued, that they're not being seen, while you claim to be all-seeing. The evil eye in our lives is mostly television, is mostly this ability to look at people and not actually see them, to look at people and see a type, to look at people and see what a border guard sees, which is having no idea who that person actually is, but meanwhile you're making a life and death judgment. To look at some old lady, and for you she's some old lady, and actually for me she's my grandmother. She's not some old lady. Nobody is some old lady. Some old lady is my grandmother. But the evil eye just sees some old lady, because the evil eye doesn't see a thing. Meanwhile, the evil eye, because of its blindness and meanwhile its arrogance, is so violent and creates generations of violence. Just generations of violence, of just the inability to look, and the look with evil intent. And in Hindu theater, in the 8th century, the plays of Kalidasa, particularly this play, Shakuntala, it's all about violence of a king against the woman he's married and loves, but he can't really see her. And so he enacts all of this appalling violence through complete blindness. And the play is this person learning to see. And of course, the reason the play has a king is, and a king is used in Hindu mythology is because all of us imagine ourselves to be kings. We are omnipotent in our realm. And again, everybody else is somewhat less important than we are. And that idea that you're the king and everyone else is just somebody who you accept or don't accept to the extent you accept or don't accept them, rather than you're equal. And the eye of love is that you see someone for who they really are. In fact, you see things about them they can't see. In fact, you see that every human being is not who they seem to be, but all of us are seeds and acorns on our way to some oak tree. And how do you see the oak tree when you're looking at the acorn? How do you see what a person is going to become? Because none of us are what we are now. All of us are hoping to be something else. What is it to meet the person who sees what you want to be, who sees what you could become, who recognizes that you're not what you look like right now? The situation of your life right now is that most of human history is about people who, amazingly, are so much more than what the world offered them. And in the case of Tan and Ahilan, they proved that. and just to say, none of us are what we look like. None of us are how we behave right now. What we're all hoping to be is something we haven't yet reached. And the eye of love sees what someone is even hiding, what they haven't said, what they are not showing you, what they don't even know to show you. Can you be with someone and hear what they're not telling you? Can you listen and see with the eye of love? And the eye of love is, when you've had a horrible day at work or at school, and you get home and you've just had horrible disappointment after disappointment, and you're angry and you're bent and you're broken and you're furious, and you arrive home at the end of the day and your partner looks at you with the eye of love. And you walked in that door a monster. And you become a person again. And it's just somebody really seeing you. And somebody seeing not your worst self, but the self they know is there, that's invisible at the moment. And reminding you that, of course, there's a better self there, waiting for a better day. And they can see that. And they recognize what you're going through. They understand, as a border guard doesn't, what you've been through. They understand why you're behaving the way you're behaving, because of course you're behaving that way, because that's what you've been through. And the eye of love can see what somebody wants to become, but also sees what somebody has been through. And that's one of the beautiful things of Sufi practice, is you're supposed to be able to see, look in someone's eyes and see everything that ever happened to them. Because that's what people are carrying with them. And realize that nobody is just who they are right now, they're what they've been through, which is still going on. that the past hasn't stopped, it's continuing. And so to understand somebody's present, you have to really know somebody's past. And meanwhile, the way you look at them is what opens a future. And they read the future, they read the fact that they have a future in your eyes. And that act of love is the act of offering and sharing a future with somebody. Sharing, as Ahilan and Tan point out, because somebody else's life becomes part of your life. And the act of love is caring more about somebody else's life than your life. And I don't mean to, people spoke earlier so powerfully about love is a word that's used to bring a lot of cruelty into the world. And love is used as exploitation, love is used as possessiveness, as control, as all kinds of things. And, you know, it has not a very good history, actually, the word love. And so the word love has to be really subjected to extreme purification and itself transformed, because like, you know, by itself, love is, you know, it's like a pencil. You can use it to draw a portrait of your beloved or a neutron bomb. It's a pencil. Love can be used like anything, as a gift or as a curse. And that's what the evil eye versus the eye of love is about. It's about this way in which we bless each other and create a space none of us can imagine yet. And look forward is what the expression is. How do you look forward? How do you see what isn't here yet? And what are the sacrifices you're willing to make for someone else? Where do you actually start to realize that your own life isn't yours? And your own life, when you offer it, becomes meaningful. And until you offer it, is not meaningful. And so this act of sacrifice, this act of loving where there is no love, this act of the kind of perfect love, which is seeing when people are behaving horribly, which in Tan's case is, of course, over and over again, but is also to see that inside of hate is actually fear. And it takes a lot of love to look at fear and see fear and not actually react with more fear. And to break the cycle of fear generating fear. And to see fear for what it is. It's just somebody's afraid. And so, of course, they're behaving horribly. And what does it mean to have enough love to break their stranglehold of fear and their illusion about themselves, which fear has trapped them in? And to release people from their own fear, which is why, of course, people behave horribly. And so this kind of love is really necessary to move through hatred. And, you know, again, in the Hindu tradition, you don't say there's really evil, because what there is ignorance. And so is your love strong enough to survive someone's ignorance and to create the space for the very person whose cruelty is really damaging to themselves and to everyone around them? Can you give them the space to become the person they actually want to be? And so for me, the act of love, the eye of love, is also about how do you create the space that every person who you meet, how do you create the space that gives them permission to become the person they would like to be, they would prefer to be? Because most people would prefer to be someone else in another situation with other possibilities. So that act of love is also an act of permission and an act of not behaving with people in a reactive state of reacting to whatever they're putting out, but having your own center that allows you the poise, the calm, the kindness, the gratitude, and not being nice to people who are nice only, but actually putting something out in the world that creates, in the Hindu tradition, it's understood as a perfume. It's that it's moving through you in the same way a perfume transforms your being. It's invisible, and yet all that anger can't survive this incredible perfume. And just one last thing about the eye of love, it's reciprocity. And in Hindu tradition, it's called darshan. It's why people go to a temple, to behold a God, so you can see the divine being and be seen by the divine being. Seeing and being seen. This is the reciprocity, and to be with another human being and recognize their divinity. And then in that process, you become recognized. It's total reciprocity. It's total equality. It's the project that this country embarked on, kind of quite imperfectly, but that idea that we are equal, that's pretty deep and pretty beautiful. And it's the eye of love being stronger than the evil eye.
Thank you, Peter. It's hard to find words.
Peter, I felt like you were talking to me when you were talking about the eye of love. I want to say, that experience that I described with that patient questioning in my every action. I went home that night, like at 9 p.m. Of course, missed the dinner that my husband had made me. And all I did was like sob hysterically and was wondering why I chose this career and wondering what kind of mistakes have I made through this life to deserve this kind of treatment. And also very ashamed of myself for having yelled at the sun. And it was in Ahilan, like I was telling you, Ahilan, like with the support of my husband, it was really like that eye of love really brought me out of that darkness.
And I have to say, it's the only thing that saved any of us, is that somebody is really sees you and cares about you and sees who you are and knows that you're your finest self and loves that self and won't let go of it and holds that as the treasure you are, because of course you're a treasure. Such a treasure. Yeah.
Peter, I found that so moving, and also it feels like so insightful as an account. I feel like you're talking to me too. It feels like so insightful as an account of what drives a lot of the most kind of oppressive policies towards immigrants and refugees. You say it's fear, and of course it's the hatred is derived itself from fear. And I understand, I hear that as humanizing border guards, and you say the evil eye sees nothing. They don't see the people who have come before them. They're blind to it because of their fear, right? I feel like some of what you're saying is also about how on an individual level, if an individual person in front of you is filled with this hatred and this fear, that you can engage that person if you can somehow find the strength and the wisdom and the love to engage with them in a certain way, right? Have you ever thought about, like, is there a way to do that collectively? Is there some, because it seems like part of what you described, the transformational moment that you described, is this very intense personal connection between two people. Is that the sort of the paradigm of it from the, whether, in your study and understanding of it, or from the, the Hindu scholar you're describing from the 8th century?
It's this weird thing that, the internet is almost helping us a little bit, but, there are enough people on earth to do everything that needs to be done. And actually, it is activating every person. It is genuinely activating every person. And those are the real metrics, and those are the real numbers, is every human being becoming a real, full human being, empowered, alive, loving, and generous, and wise. And that work is called education. That's what we're here to do. Is every human being is that. I mean, what we're struggling with is ignorance, and the remedy is education. Is actually empowering every single person in this class, every single person at UCLA, every single person is that active empowerment. Of course, what I do in theater and music and film and dance and so on is a collective version of that. And I have one project where we worked in 9 countries and made a very intense immigration refugee project with people without papers, border guards, detention center employees and guards, immigration judges. I mean, everybody in every part of the ecosystem, and involved everybody in an art project. And the fact that it was an art project suddenly gave everyone permission to have a more fluid identity. Because most people have these very fixed identities, and they believe it and they think of it. And of course, none of us do. All of us, the whole point about being human is we change every minute. Every second of our lives is change. And whatever you thought was going to happen last year isn't what happens. And so, all of our lives are changing every minute. So you need to create the conditions where people stop thinking institutionally that something is permanent and has always been this way, et cetera, et cetera. And you just actually get people into a fluid space of getting an immigration judge to go beyond the 10 points he has on the list of things he has to ask someone and check off, and how do you create another space for that person who themselves is a prisoner, and so you realize in every part of the system, I mean, a ton knows this in the medical system, you're a prisoner of a certain type of behavior and looking and metric that is itself already suffocating and is in fact counterproductive. And so can we create spaces, as Tom has, with that terrace, where somebody can suddenly go beyond the job description and be fully human and recognize the full humanity of everyone, actually. And we all need that space because we have all been institutionalized in the last 30, 40 years. And this is actually pretty recent. The overwhelming presence of this type of thinking. And so we have to just bring back the humanities, which is, of course, deliberately why the generation that created this thinking has eclipsed the humanities and removed all the funding for the humanities and said, we only fund science. Because, in fact, the humanities challenge what you think you know about somebody and situations, and just say, no, there's a way deeper knowledge that again allows us to be equal. So, but it's a process. And so, yes, I mean, I spend a lot of my life creating collective experiences of this, but also the experience, frankly, has to have high stakes, and because your life is only changed when you go through life-changing events. And so, what's so powerful about the ICU is it's the ICU. It's like, hello, if change enters your life, you've come to the right place, because this is the space where change enters your life, and the stakes are really high. And most people don't understand how high the stakes are. And I would say most people who have comfortable lives have no idea what one day in a refugee camp is like, let alone what 2 generations in a refugee camp is like. And so the people who are voting and creating, policy all around the world of course, if they could spend one day in a refugee camp, it would change everything. So part of it is, again, it's just ignorance. And so it's, as artists, what we're trying to do is extend an idea of what people are going through to people who literally cannot imagine what that would be, and how high the stakes actually are. Because for most people, American life has been constructed in a way that you don't see what the stakes are. You don't see who died to feed you today. And for me, this question of sacrifice is also, the animals and the living beings that gave their lives so you have one more day on earth. I mean, just the awareness of the amount of sacrifice that keeps all of us alive every minute. This is deep stuff, but it's hidden. And again, death is hidden. And if we had a culture that put death in front of people on a regular basis, again, so we know what the real stakes are, then the need to love is immediate and real, and love is the only thing that actually counts in your whole life. So, I mean, nothing else actually matters. So, but if more American families had to take in refugees, of course, like your family, it would change the picture. And of course, if COVID, I think, did, we still have no idea how to react to COVID because the media, everybody's been in denial about it and says, oh, it's over now. And you want to just say, well, what about the 5 million people who died with no one to say goodbye, and the 5 million families who couldn't say goodbye? Isn't that a change of being? Doesn't this time in history feel different? And but people are have so much emotional distance or denial. So just to say, what are we learning from being alive right now? With the largest number of refugees and people having to flee their countries in the history of the planet. And the widest spread, the most amount of slaves ever. I mean, the largest amount of slaves in the history of the planet. And 5 million extra deaths. So yes, you want to say the need for love is real.
I have a question. Time has flown by, but not surprisingly so. We have an extraordinary group of people with us tonight, most of whom are in their early 20s. And I know that we're all, even those of us who are more than in our 20s, are listening so deeply to every word. But if you had something you could say right now, maybe thinking back to your 21-year-old self, to help us all move forward in the action of love, what would it be? What can you share this evening before we leave for our 21-year-old students who are here tonight?
I think, may I start?
Of course.
I think my main word of advice is to don't sweat the small stuff. And I think that being the physician that I have been through my career and seeing how tragic the life can be and how wonderful it is to have people that love you around you, I think that we as people stress the small stuff way too much. And I think that stems from probably being an ICU doctor, but I also think that it makes life a lot easier if you realize a lot of things are temporary, but also that things are never as bad as you think they are.
I definitely second that. I think I worried a lot about a lot of things in my 20s that that now I look back and they weren't necessarily worth worrying about. Another thing, just to take it in a different direction, I think it's really important to realize that the world as it is now is not the way that it has to be. And even the world that you have experienced your whole life is not the way that it has to be. And I feel like that in kind of two directions. One is things that to you might seem like, of course, this is always the way it was. People around you who are older can remember that it used to be a different way, and therefore, you can imagine, and it is possible that it doesn't have to be that way. I think about that for me in my first job, sort of full job after law school, and I worked for a judge, and then I was in New York on 9/11, and so much of what we have done in this country, which to me feels really deeply misguided, the way we treat Muslim Americans, the way we treat immigrants, a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, like I'm just barely old enough to remember that it didn't have to be this way. We didn't have to lock up lots and lots of immigrants. We didn't have to treat people as inherently suspicious just because they practice, one particular religion. And that's, I think, is sort of a gift that comes from history. And I feel like I wish in a way that when I was in my 20s, I had focused just a little bit more on how things used to be as a guide to kind of how they could be, if that makes any sense. And then at the same time, I think in the other direction, of course, because you're young, you have the ability to think and imagine a possibility of things that older people can't see, precisely because we have lived with the way things have been for a long period of time. So just always just try and bear in mind possibility, possibility for yourself, possibility for the world, all the ways in which things could be different and hopefully better.
Yeah, I would thank you. I'm totally and I would just say again, the news is just the news because the only story is a bad story. Something has to be negative to turn into news, and in fact, the news is actually that billions of mothers feed their families every day in spite of everything. How they did it in places where there is no economy, how they do it over and over again is a miracle. And in fact, life exists because of miracles, and everything in your life is actually a miracle. And everything you ever had is somebody gave you. Is that there's nothing you ever made yourself. And so in fact, this incredible gift economy is the only real economy. It's the only thing that ever existed. It's the only thing that makes life happen. And people have been distracted by money, and it's perfectly clear that the evil eye folks have everything and yet are so unhappy. And we've all been trained to want to be the have everything thing. And you want to say, excuse me, have less and be part of the miracle, and enter this space where you don't know, and you surrender, and you actually recognize that you don't know what's next, and you're free. And that kind of freedom, please, you guys who are younger, please take that freedom now, because everybody's trying to tell you, you've got to get this job, it has to make a lot of money, and blah, 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 blah. And, that hasn't ended well for the two previous generations who got their jobs and have been fired every time Citibank, fires 50,000 people per month. And so you just want to say, hold it. What is life about? Live for that. And again, the job of artists is to look around and say, as Ahilan just said, what is missing from this picture? As Tan showed you, what is missing from this picture? Why are people dying unhappy and without fulfillment, without some beautiful thing fulfilled? And where is the beauty? Because there's way more beauty than hurt and ugliness. There's way more beauty. How many flowers are in that flowering tree? You can't count them. Please just inhale. and realize that the good is actually infinite and the evil is self-destructive. It won't last. It can't last because it doesn't know how to sustain life. So, and obviously, as is the history of this country, it's this country, whatever is great in this country is because people came here needing to change their lives and needing to find fulfillment and willing to offer, as Tan and Ahilan have said, body and soul. And body and soul is what it takes.
I don't want to end, but I feel as though there's so much here to stay with. Tan and Ahilan, if there's anything else that you want to add before we close this up, I welcome that.
I just want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and I want to thank Tan and Peter both for their thoughts and for their work. Tan, much love and hope to you and the amazing life-saving work that you're doing. Life-saving and life-giving, I guess, work that you're doing.
Thank you. I want to echo the same words, and I feel really humbled to be part of this group. And I told Peter in his chat, but I feel like he should be on my speakerphone, and I should record some of his conversations so that I could listen to it during my darkest moments during these past 18 months of the pandemic. So inspirational. So thank you. And Ahilan, your work is amazing. It's like I said, it struck a deep chord because it is my family and my roots, and I'm so glad that there's people like you fighting for others.
And I have to say the same, and can I just say, be shameless and just say, I really want to create projects with both of you, and maybe all together, but just, it's super inspiring, the work you're doing, and let's find other dimensions of it that can be shared. Just total gratitude and all admiration, really, really.
Thank you so very much.
And thank you, Vic, for bringing everyone together, because that's 3/4 of life, is bring everyone together. Who needs to meet whom? That is what we're on earth to do, is please bring people together. Please let people meet. And it is a better world, yes.
Things do happen, don't they, when we come together. Thank you all for being here with us tonight to consider how do we love. In the days and weeks and months ahead, let's lead with love in the small acts of our daily lives, in the work we do, and in the kindness and empathy we show ourselves or others in the world. This concludes this evening's program and the fall 2021 edition of 10 Questions, If Not Now, When? If you missed any of our sessions and would like to listen to a recording, please visit arts.ucla.edu/10questions. This is offered with love. Good night.